In previous videos, we've taken a Dell R630 rack server, we powered it up, we updated the firmware and the BIOS, we also provisioned a physical disk as a virtual drive in that server, and we're now at the point in our journey together to do the actual install of the ESXi hypervisor on this bare metal server. So that's what you and I get to do right now. So here's our Dell R630. You and I are sitting at this management computer, and we are connected over to this via iDRAC. And on this server, we also have a virtual disk that we've prepared, which we did through iDRAC. And that way, when we want to use this disk, we can for a data store. Now, for the actual deployment of the ESXi software itself, instead of using that physical disk, let's use a little flash drive. Now, on the motherboard, on this R630, there's a USB slot. So there's some external on the front and back. So if we take the case off and plug in a little USB stick, we can actually install the operating system, the ESXi software, to that little flash drive. Now, in a production environment, we don't want to use a flash drive because there's a potential failure point for our system. However, in a lab environment where we don't want to have to buy additional disks or do additional partitioning here, installing ESXi on the flash drive itself makes a lot of sense. So on the physical R630 server, I powered it down, I removed the case, I installed this little flash drive in the internal USB port, and now logically we have two drives. This little drive, I think is 64 gigs or something similar to that, and that's where we'll install the ESXi host software. And then I also have this other SSD disk that we prepared in the previous video that when we get to the point of installing and creating a data store, we'll use this bigger disk right here, which is close to 1 terabyte. So the ESXi software we're going to be using for this series of videos, I got through VMUG Advantage. So with a VMUG Advantage membership, which is $200 a year US, they supply you with not only the images that you can download and use, but also a 1-year evaluation license for many of those products as well. And the software we're going to use is in the form of an ISO. Think of it like a CD/DVD. How do we get that down here so we can install the ESXi software from that ISO to that flash drive? Now, some servers might have a physical CD/DVD drive, so we could actually burn that to plastic and then put it in this drive and then boot from it there, or we could make a bootable flash drive and plug it into a USB port on the server and tell it to boot from there, or because we already have iDRAC set up, we did that in the previous video, what we could do on our management computer right here is we could go ahead and take that ISO file and logically mount it to the server. And then we could tell the server to go ahead and boot from it, and that would allow us to do the install. And iDRAC makes that super easy. So sitting right here at our management computer, let me walk you through the process of doing the initial installation of ESXi, the hypervisor, on this physical server. So here in iDRAC, if we don't already have a console open, we'll click right here on Launch to launch a virtual console over to our physical server. So this represents the console of the server, and at the moment, it doesn't have any boot devices that have anything to boot from. So it's just looping over and over again here, looking for a device to boot from, including attempting to boot from the internal USB drive that I have placed on the motherboard of the physical server. So what I'm going to do here in the virtual console is click right here on Connect Virtual Media, and then I'll go ahead and click right here on Choose File, and I'll go grab that ISO file on my local computer, and we'll logically mount that over to the physical server. So we'll click here on Choose File, I grab the ISO image that I got from VMUG, and then we'll click right here on Map Device. So now that ISO image is logically attached to the physical server. Let me go ahead and close that dialog window. So right here, I'm going to click in this window to make it active and then hit the F11 key for Boot Manager, because I want to tell the physical server that it should attempt to boot from that virtual CD/DVD drive. So up here, it's showing us that it's mapped. And then I'm going to go ahead and choose right here the one-shot UEFI boot menu. So we'll select that, and then I want to go ahead and tell it to boot from the virtual optical drive, and that's the one I just connected. So I'm going to click on virtual optical drive, and now it's going to attempt to boot from that virtual drive. And there we go, that's a very good sign. So it's now loading the ESXi installer from that CD/DVD drive that we virtually mapped over to that physical server. So we'll go ahead and give this process a few minutes until it asks us for some input. And again, this is the installation of the ESXi hypervisor software on the physical server. And again, when we get to the install process, we're going to be targeting the flash drive that's on the motherboard. And certainly another option, if we don't want to do the installation to a flash drive on the motherboard, if you have multiple disks or want to do some partitioning of those disks, you could do that as well. However, I found that in a lab environment, especially if we're trying to minimize expense, using a separate flash drive just for the install of the ESXi is a super easy and economical option for deploying the initial software on the host. And that way we're freeing up the other physical disk, all of it, to be used as part of a data store. So also while this is getting ready, it's also indicating that we have 2 Intel Xeon processors, that's the flavor, and that we have 255 gigs of RAM in this server. So one of the tools that's pretty handy is the compatibility matrix provided by VMware that can help you identify which processors and which systems are compatible with vSphere 8. Now, currently this processor, the E5-2670, is not compatible with 8. It is compatible with some versions of 7, but as I mentioned earlier, even though it's not fully supported, it actually works. And so you'd want to just confirm that whatever processor you're going to be using can be used even if it's not fully supported. And again, that makes it a lot less expensive in a lab environment as well. Because companies that used to use this for their production environments have moved them out and replaced them with newer hardware and newer processors, which for individuals who want to build a home lab environment makes that hardware a lot less expensive for us to use. And again, this physical server with over 250 gigs of RAM was around $300. So I did take an existing hard drive I have, an SSD drive, but you could also use a spinning disk either way, and I placed that in slot 0, and that's the drive we prepared in the previous video, and getting the physical server all ready to go. So here's a warning message that indicates that even though VMware's ESXi 8 as part of vSphere installs on most systems, it's only supported based on what they specify is compatible. And it's also providing the URL we can use to go ahead and check on that. So I'm going to press enter to continue. And then here we have the end user license agreement, and I'll press F11 to accept and continue. So now it's scanning for all available devices, and it's identified the 930 plus gigabyte hard drive that we provisioned in the previous video, as well as the USB stick that I have plugged into the motherboard, which is just under 60 gig. And so what we want to do is, for the lab, I want to deploy the ESXi software itself on that USB disk. And then we'll leave the other 930 plus gig drive available for data store usage. So with the flash stick that's plugged into the motherboard selected, highlighted here in yellow, I'll go ahead and press enter to continue. It's now scanning that disk. It's warning me that it's going to be overwritten. I'll press enter to confirm. And then it's warning me also that a USB/SD card device was selected for the install, and optionally we can select one disk to store the ESX OS data. So I'm not going to put a check there because I want to leave this disk completely for VMs and storage as part of a data store. So in the lab environment, I'm not going to select that option, and then I'm going to press enter to continue. And so here we have another warning saying, hey, it's not a great idea to install the ESXi host software on a USB device. And I'm going to say for a lab environment, I'm aware. I'll press enter to continue. For the keyboard layout, I'll select US default. And then I'm going to specify a password that I want to use for the root user once ESXi is installed. So we have a root user account for iDRAC, which is separate. And now we're specifying a password for the root user on this ESXi host. So I've put in that password, I've confirmed that password, and I'll press enter to continue. So here we have the warning saying, hey, you know what? The CPUs that you have in this server, they are not supported officially on ESXi version 8. But if you want to, you can override it and force the install, but just realize it's not officially supported. So I'll press enter to continue. And then one more time, are you sure you want to force unsupported installation of ESXi version 8? And I'm going to press enter to force the install. And then one more time, we'll press F11 to go ahead and partition that flash disk and then do the install of ESXi. So I'll hit F11 and we are on our way. And one other thing to be aware of is that we also may need to go back into the BIOS on the server to make sure it is attempting to boot from that flash drive. Because if it doesn't try to boot from that USB stick, it won't find the operating system and won't be able to load up the ESXi hypervisor. So in the event when we're done, if it doesn't boot from that drive, from that flash disk, we may need to go in and tweak the BIOS. So we'll go ahead and let that continue. And then once it's done, we'll go ahead and we'll remove the virtual media and we'll reboot this physical host. At which point it should boot from the flash disk and then we have ESXi ready to go. Or at least ESXi in its initial state once it's been installed. Also, I want to take advantage of this time during the install just to point out that even though this version of ESXi host software that we're installing on this physical server, maybe it's not the most current. For example, there's like updates periodically. It doesn't have to be the latest and greatest on the physical host, because in our nested environment, it'll be super easy because we'll have multiple logical ESXi hosts to use vCenter to go ahead and do updates of those VMs. So again, on the physical host that's running ESXi, we really don't need to be too concerned about having the latest and greatest updated version of the hypervisor software. And the reason I point that out is because if we only have one host, our physical server, and we're running vCenter as well, we don't really have another host we can use to move vCenter around while one of our hosts is being updated. And that's why in a lab environment, it's often easier just to take the initial version of the ESXi hypervisor software that we deployed and leave it, because we don't have a lot of other hosts we can use for vMotion in the event we want to do an update. Also, while the install is completing, let me show you an example of a hard drive. So this is a spinning hard drive, and it's mounted so that it can be installed inside the physical server. So this case came from Dell. There's also third-party companies that make them. So you can physically attach the drive to the rails and then simply slide it into the server. So you slide it in and then use this to seat it all the way in. And then it has a physical connection to the server. So I currently have one similar to this, except it's not a spinning disk, it's a solid-state drive that's plugged into slot 0 on this physical server. And that's the disk that we provisioned in the previous video, where we took the physical disk and made a virtual disk using the iDRAC software and behind the scenes, the lifecycle manager, to go ahead and provision that virtual disk. And again, all we really need is just one physical disk, and then as we start deploying virtual machines, including nested ESXi hosts, we'll use the process called thin provisioning, so we're really not going to tie up a ton of disk storage, even though our virtual machines may believe they have a ton of it. And actually, I just realized prior to rebooting, I also want to make sure that we have a network connection besides the one that we're using for iDRAC that the server itself is able to use. So back here in the iDRAC GUI interface, if we go to hardware and expand that, and let's go down to network devices. Here it's showing I have this integrated NIC1, and if we click on that, this card has 4 ports. Now, 2 of them are SFP ports that take a little module, and the other 2 are straight up RJ45 connectors. So the other thing I want to do right now is go ahead and plug in to one of those ports. So once we bring up the server, it can have connectivity to my home network as well. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in one of the RJ45 connectors on the back of the server to a switch, and let me go ahead and do a refresh here. And it is that one right there that just changed to up. So this has a link speed of 1 gigabit per second. There's the MAC address. Fantastic. So once we have this up and running, we'll use that network interface card for the server itself to communicate with my network. So we have the Dell server. I've got one connection right here, which is being used for iDRAC. And then on this Dell, it has 4 more ports right here. And I've just plugged in a cable to this port right here, which is port number 4. And it is also now plugged into my network. And on my network, I have DHCP services already set up, meaning that if this device acts as a DHCP client saying, hey, I need an IP address, the DHCP server available on this network segment can go ahead and dynamically assign an IP address to the server on this port of the network interface card right there. All right, so we go back to the main screen here for the install. So it says it's done. There's an eval period for 60 days. If we don't license it, we'll go ahead and license it with our vMug licensing and reboot. So before I do the reboot, I'm going to go ahead and click right here on virtual media. And I want to go ahead and unmap that device. Effectively, I'm taking away that ISO image, so it's no longer available to this host. And now I'll click right here and press enter to reboot. So now the question is, as we reboot this physical server, will it or will it not boot to the ESXi software that's on that flash drive? All right, so we have some messages regarding F2 to go into system setup, F10 for lifecycle manager, F11 for boot manager, and F12 for Pixie boot. And survey says it is loading ESXi, and that means it is actually booting from that flash disk where we installed the ESXi2. That is fantastic. So we'll give it a few moments to fully initialize, and then we'll go in and we'll tweak the IP address with what we want it to use for the management connection to the ESXi host as this new server begins its journey in the world of vSphere. So let's map out our plan of what we want to have happen. I want this server in my lab environment to be using the IP address of 192.168.1. And I want to use 106 for the management interface IP address on this ESXi host. So previously we set up iDRAC, which is still in place. We're using it right now as we speak. And the iDRAC address for managing the server as a whole is at .241. So we're going to maintain that and keep that in place in the event we ever need to go back and work with the server via iDRAC. But from a vSphere perspective with ESXi, we're going to go ahead and manually assign the address of 106. So at the moment, because we're plugged into my office network here, it's going to get an IP address via DHCP. And this interface here is called the DCUI, which is the Direct Console User Interface. And we'll just simply change the IP address from the DHCP address it's going to get over to this IP address right here. So it shows that currently at the moment, it doesn't have an IP address. But it does say right here, waiting for DHCP. So let's give that a moment and see whether or not it gets an IP address from my DHCP server. And it did not. It got a 169 address, which implies that it looked for DHCP services, but couldn't find them. But either way, because we're right here, courtesy of iDRAC, we can just press F2, log in right here, and just change the IP address. So I'll press F2. That's the prompt down here at the bottom. And then we'll specify the root user and the password that we set up for root. So I'll put that in. And then we'll press enter. And we are logged in. So then here from the menu, I'll just go down to Configure Management Network. And for network adapters, oh, there's the problem right there. We want this one. And that's where we currently are connected into my home office network. So with VMNIC3 specify, which is the one that's currently connected, we'll go ahead and select that. And then we'll go down to IPv4 and give it the IP address that we want to use. So I'll go down to Set Static IPv4 Address, hit the space bar to select that, then down arrow, and then put in the IP address of 192.168.1.106. And the default gateway I want it to use here on my home network is 192.168.1.1, and press enter. And then we'll go down to IPv6 and press enter and say I don't want to use IPv6 and press enter. And then for DNS, initially I want to go ahead and use DNS server out at Google, put an 8.8.8.8. And then for the host name, I'm going to call this guy ESXi-6.ogit.local. Even though I don't yet have DNS set up for that, I will eventually. So I'm going to go ahead and call it that. We'll press enter. And then for the custom DNS suffix, I'm going to go ahead and say ogit.local and press enter. So for network adapters, I'm using my fourth network adapter, which is VMNIC3 from the perspective of ESXi, starting at 0, then 1, 2, and 3. I'm not putting any 802.1q VLAN tags on there. For IPv4, I want to use this IP address, 192.168.1.106 with the default gateway of .1. I'm going to disable IPv6 altogether. And for DNS, the primary part here is that we're going to use 8888, which is a Google DNS server. And as far as the actual host name and the custom DNS suffixes, don't matter too much for our lab environment at this point. So we'll go ahead and I'll hit escape. Now it's asking me if I want to apply these changes and reboot, and I'll hit Y for yes. So that is doing the reboot, and when it comes back, it should be reachable at the IP address of 192.168.1.106. So once it fully initializes, a couple other things I want to do right now in this video is, number one, I want to go ahead and create a data store on this local ESXi host. And then secondly, I want to apply the license. And that way it won't nag me about my licenses being about to expire. And again, the licensing we're going to use is the licensing I got as part of vMug Advantage. So in preparation for connecting to this, let's open up a browser and go to 192.168.1.106. And when we hit that site, it should redirect us over to HTTPS, and it should ask us to authenticate. So we can log in as root, and then we'll specify the password that I supplied when we deployed this ESXi host. All right, so that just confirms for us that that's the IP address at .106. So let's open up a browser and connect there. And here we go. So I've connected to that IP address. It redirected me to HTTPS. It's warning me that my browser can't verify the certificate. No worries there. It's a brand new server. We'll click on Advanced and click on Proceed. And then we'll log on as root. And this little icon over here is my password manager. That's not part of the native interface. And I'll supply the password. And we'll click Login. It's asking us if we want to join the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program for my lab environment. I'll go ahead and say no to that and click on OK. And then the two things I want to take care of right out of the gate was, one, I want to create a data store. This is the ESXi host client. So on the left, we'll click on Storage, and here with these Data Stores tab selected, right below that, we'll click right here on New Data Store. And then we'll choose the default option of Create a New VMFS Data Store. We'll click on Next. And I'll call this ESXi6 Data Store, although you can name it whatever you want. And later you can rename it if you like. And here is the disk that it found. This is the disk we provisioned a couple videos ago. So we'll select that, click on Next. We'll take all the space, click on Next, click on Finish, and click on Yes. And now we have a data store. And then the last thing here in this video I want to do is install the license. So to do that, we'll go to Manage under Host. We'll click on the Licensing tab here. And at the moment, I'm running an eval license that comes by default. And so I want to go ahead and click on Assign License right here. Then I'll plug in my license key information and then click on Check License. So now that it has a license and we also have a data store in place, our next logical step then is to go ahead and deploy vCenter for centralized management. So join me in the next video as we deploy as a VM the vCenter server appliance on this ESXi host.